Today we have Dr. Chris Erskine. He has a PhD in Sino-U.S. Relations from HKU. He's also a professor of history and history education at Athens State University in the United States. Hi, Chris. It's nice to have you here today.
Hi, Stella. Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
And thanks for joining our program today. So, Chris, what is so unprecedented about all these protests across China? Or may we ask, why are these protests so significant?
I think they're hugely significant, but maybe not in the way that a lot of kind of Western watchers want to interpret them. Often in the West, when we see protests in China or things that we're seeing now, we hope for we hope that maybe this is the beginning of the end of the communist rule in China. But I think that's not the case. I think that we're a long way from that, and not even sure that that's a good thing right now. But they're hugely significant and possibly to benefit both the government, because if they handle the loosening and they've responded to the protests, they could be seen 6 months, a year down the road as having responded very, very positively to what the people have asked them to do. And certainly the people, it can be a benefit to the people because they can see that protests work. That doesn't mean that everything's great. It just means that I think the benefit can go both ways here and the significance is huge, I think, for both the government and the protesters themselves.
All right, and China announced last Wednesday the most sweeping changes to its tough zero COVID policy since the pandemic began around 3 years ago. Do you see an end to this wave of the April revolution, or should we expect a growth of large-scale protests in the future?
Yeah, I think we're probably at an end. I mean, we may see periodic protests. I would be surprised even to see that. Within a week of when these protests were put down, and the machinery, the government machinery to suppress these protests is very effective and very polished. And so, a lot of what we've seen has been scrubbed from the internet, and we're really not even sure, how widespread those protests were, honestly. But because the government has been very effective at putting them down, and because they've also opened up within a week of the protests, loosened up that zero COVID policy, I would be surprised to see more protests or protests that are significant. You're not going to get the kind of mass protests across 15 or 20 cities like we had at the end of November.
And Chris, do you think it signifies that Chinese people are not just dissatisfied with COVID policies, but they're unhappy with the regime or the whole political system? Or do you think this poses any threat to challenges to Xi Jinping at all?
So I don't think it would be a threat or a challenge to Xi Jinping, not in practical terms. He may feel his pride is hurt, but I think in practical terms of him retaining power, there's no threat. And generally speaking, the contacts that I have, the Chinese contacts that I have both inside China and outside of China, tell me that the people will be happy once the COVID restrictions have been loosened. During those COVID restrictions, I had contacts that were in China that were saying that they could not leave. They were locked in their apartment building, and now they're reporting that they are very happy. They're not going to protest. It's a lot of foreign influence.
Right.
And so I don't expect that we're going to see any real threat to Xi Jinping or the Communist Party. People largely, this is a happy generation. This is not the Tiananmen Square generation. We're largely going to see a generation that is going to be happy to go back to work, to go back out to eat, to go to movies, and to kind of get back to life as normal.
And Chris, you've lived in Hong Kong for many years. Many people in Hong Kong are now saying the protests gave them a feeling of deja vu. Do you believe the outcome will be similar for both?
Well, in the sense that the outcome, that the protests were only partially successful, I think they would be similar. Hong Kong, you have protests that start in June of 2019 and go through early to mid-January of 2020 before they finally peter out because of COVID. And in July of 2019, the protesters in Hong Kong stormed the LegCo. We're not going to see any similarities here because the protesters in China, if they were to attempt to storm the People's National Congress in Beijing, would not happen. It would be brutally suppressed. If we were to see similarities, the similarities would be that the extradition law that the Hong Kong protesters were against was temporarily postponed, and the COVID restrictions that the Chinese protesters on the mainland were protesting have been loosened. But the big difference here is that the protests in Hong Kong lasted more than 6 months, and it's documented widely. The protests in China lasted less than a week and are largely now scrubbed from the internet. At least in China, they've been scrubbed. So there are some similarities, but I think that a lot of the look for similarities is maybe in the Western mind wanting to project on what they want to happen in China.
All right. Thank you, Chris. That's all the time we have today, but we hope to have you on our show very soon again.
Thank you so much, Del. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.